Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the weirdest tank or family of tanks, the Strv 103s in the game of War Thunder. On the surface, the Strv 103 family looks like a fairly standard casemate tank destroyer like you've seen in several other tech trees. However, the Strv 103 actually uses several mechanics that are basically unique to this tank and appear essentially nowhere else in the entire game. Additionally, since the Strv 103A and C are so similar, as is the premium Strv 103, we are going to be looking at all three of them at the same time, and I will note the differences where appropriate. The Strv 103 project started as a complementary project to the then in service Centurion tanks that the Swedish have. If you're curious, Strv is essentially main battle tank. 10 is the caliber of the gun in centimeters, so it is a 10 centimeter gun, and the 3 at the end also denotes it is the third vehicle to have a gun of that caliber of that type. So Strv 103 just means that it is the third main battle tank to have a 10 centimeter gun. What marks the Strv 103 family, or S-tanks as they're commonly called, apart from other main battle tanks, is obviously they don't have a turret. But above and beyond simply not having a turret, they are essentially designed so that the entire tank is basically just a gun on tracks. The entire tank moves in order to aim the gun, and it elevates and depresses the entire tank in order to aim it. This design offered several benefits, such as the Strvs having a very low profile. They also had a very steeply sloped upper front plate that could ricochet the vast majority of shells that were in service at the time, even up to and including some of the early APDS rounds. On top of that, because you're keeping the entire tank, the gun, the magazine, and the breech in the same alignment at all times, it makes designing the autoloader significantly simpler. This also brings up the point that as far as the Swedish were concerned, this was a main battle tank. It was not a tank destroyer, and it was issued and used like a main battle tank by the Swedes. Ultimately, the two fatal flaws for the Strv 103 series was that, number one, the steeply sloped upper front plate only worked as long as you were dealing with more conventional shells. As fin stabilized shells, and especially long rods at very high velocities, started to enter service, this essentially negated the slope of the tank entirely, as they could easily bite into even such a sharp angle. Additionally, the other problem was that as stabilizers and advanced fire control systems were becoming more common, you simply can't stabilize a gun when the gun is the entire tank. These factors combined means that the Strv 103s, despite being a very unique tank, were ultimately replaced in service by the very conventional Leopard 2A4s, which were named by the Swedish as the Strv 121s and later 122s. Now, as an interesting side note, before we get into the S-tanks themselves, all three of the S-tanks are considered medium tanks in the game of War Thunder per their Swedish categorization. So they are not tank destroyers. They do have access to things like artillery strikes, and they do have the higher spawn cost. Now, typically when I talk about the history of a vehicle, it's not that relevant in terms of its actual gameplay in War Thunder. However, in terms of the S-tanks, this actually is a pretty big factor because, as I said in the description, the entire tank is a gun. The gun does not have any independent elevation or traverse drives. In order to aim the gun, you literally have to aim the entire tank. Obviously, you aim the tank left or right by rotating the tank. However, in order to aim it up or down, you have to use a hydropneumatic suspension. To facilitate getting this work, the developers added a hull aiming mechanic that you can activate or deactivate, and it's important to talk about that before talking about any other part of the tank. What hull aiming mode does is, while it is active, your aiming controls will override your movement controls. So if you are trying to aim to the right and you use the movement controls to try and turn to the left, the aiming to the right will actually override it. On top of that, while in hull aiming mode, when you try to move the cursor up or down, it will actually aim the tank up or down by moving the suspension accordingly without you having to manually adjust it. So hull aiming mode is basically there to allow you to aim the tank without having to manually adjust both the suspension and rotate the tank at the same time, in addition to trying to aim the gun. When you disable hull aiming mode, the vehicle will drive normally, and basically you just can't aim the gun at that point, or you can still fire it if something is directly in front of you, but it is incredibly difficult to aim the tank while you're not in hull aiming mode. The good news is that while hull aiming mode is a separate button map you will have to use, the only vehicles that currently use it are the S-tanks and also the VT-12, which is an old German event vehicle that's actually pretty uncommon, and most people watching this probably don't have it. So you can have overlapping controls as long as it's something that you don't need on the S-tanks. For example, for hull aiming mode, I just use the special weapon button because obviously none of these vehicles have special weapons. Notably, by default, the vehicle will start in hull aiming mode, and I believe the reason why the designers did this, even though it is kind of annoying because you don't usually need to aim the instant you spawn, is because if they didn't do this and also they didn't tell players how hull aiming works, anybody picking these tanks up without doing any research research would basically not be able to aim the tank if it didn't start in hull aiming mode. So it basically starts you in this mode as a bit of a crutch because the game has a bad habit of just not telling you things you need to know. If you need to know what mode your tank is in at any given time, this little icon in the middle of the screen, if it's grayed out in the back, you are not in hull aiming mode. If it is black, you are in hull aiming mode. So that's the easy way to tell at a glance. Kicking us off as we always do, we're going to be looking at the mobility aspect of the tank, and the tanks are reasonably mobile. All three of the tanks have a top speed of around 50 kph, which isn't that impressive, but honestly considering their battle ratings, with the 103A and the 103O being at 8.0 and the 103C being at 8.7, there aren't a lot of other vehicles that you'll commonly find that are significantly faster than the S-tanks, so while this isn't exactly an amazing top speed, it's more than enough in most situations. This is also where we find one of the key differences between the two 8.0 tanks and the one 8.7 tank, and that is the 8.0 tanks both have a 540 horsepower engine, whereas the 8.7 tank has a 780 horsepower engine. Now the 8.7 version, the 103C, actually does weigh a little bit more, about 7 tons, but it still has a generally superior power to weight ratio, so it does accelerate a lot better and it does perform a lot better on soft grounds. There is a very slight difference in terms of the overall top speed of the three tanks, but it's honestly not even noticeable. It's like 1 or 2 kilometers an hour, so you won't even really notice the difference in that area. It's more the acceleration of the 103C that's going to immediately stand out. Obviously, as the tank has to be able to rotate aim the gun, it does have neutral steer instead of pivot steer, so it can turn around on a dime. Another great feature about these vehicles is that the reverse speed is around 45 kph, so not quite as fast as the forward speed, but still very fast, and the transmission in reverse speed works perfectly fine as well. So it works really well for getting you up to a position, firing, and then getting back off of that position. If I were to overall characterize the mobility, the 103A and the 103O can feel a bit sluggish at times, but they're not too bad. The 103C actually feels pretty good, even though it does on average fight enemies that have more mobility and does have more allies with more mobility. The extra acceleration you get and the actually pretty decent top speed still helps the 103C feel a lot better to play. And now we're moving on to the protection aspect, and this is where things are going to start to get really weird. Now, going with the basics, the two Tech Tree tanks do have smoke grenade launchers, however the 103O doesn't. And if you're wondering where the smoke grenade launchers are located, I had to do some checking to figure this out. They're actually on the commander's cupola. You can see them right here. So if you're ever wondering, that's where they are, and also that's the reason why the 103O, which is basically a prototype tank, doesn't have them. Now, across most aspects of the vehicle, the armor of the 103s won't seem that impressive. It is enough to keep things like 50 cals and other heavy machine guns out of the vehicle from basically every angle. However, most of the tanks you fight can go through you with their main guns from basically anywhere except for the upper front plate. The upper front plate is a fairly bouncy aspect of the vehicle. Any APHE round is basically guaranteed to bounce. Most heat rounds will not fuse correctly, and those that do fuse correctly are going to struggle to penetrate, and APDS rounds will also very much struggle to not simply shatter on your UFP. So your UFP on this tank does remain fairly stable. The biggest issue you're going to run into with the UFP, as also happened in real life, is the higher velocity darts that you're going to start to see, especially in max up tiers for the Stritzfong 103C at 8.7. You will fight some darts that can just go straight through your upper front plate with basically no issues. Of course, as we've seen time and time again on this channel, just having good armor or bad armor isn't necessarily the entire truth of exactly how much it will take to take down a vehicle. So we're going to have to look at the internal layout, and the internal layout for this vehicle is not exactly normal. The entire front section is taken up by the engine and transmission, and there are firewalls separating the engine and transmission from the main crew compartment. So if the front of the tank does get hit and penetrated, it is very likely to knock out the engine and the transmission, but it's also very unlikely to get to your main crew unless it has a lot of residual penetration when it passes through your armor. This is also one of the reasons why S-tanks can seem remarkably tanky, especially when you can't see their lower plate and you can only see their upper plate, because even if you can pen it, there's still a lot of material that your shell and the shrapnel has to get through. Of course, this is where the hull aiming mode actually comes into play in terms of protection, because obviously if they knock out your engine and transmission, you can't move normally. However, the hull aiming mode has a rather weird feature in that if you have hull aiming mode enabled, it puts you into this rather bizarre neutral gear so that your tank can still move. It's not moving under its own power, but for example, if you're on the reverse side of a hill and somebody knocks out your engine and transmission, you can turn on the hull aiming mode, angle your tank upwards, and then you will slide back down the hill. This is actually kind of a weird feature, and I'm not sure if it's supposed to work this way or if it's just an eccentricity of how hull aiming works, but it does mean that in certain scenarios you can actually roll out of danger, assuming you had some cover to start with. Additionally, you can still lower the tank while in hull aiming mode even if your engine and transmission are out, and lowering the tank means that all they can shoot is the upper front plate, and you're putting even more of that engine and transmission between the enemy shells and your crew. So usually a good survival tactic if you are in one of the S tanks and they do knock out your engine and transmission is to immediately lower the front of your tank. That way the enemy has to shoot through a lot more material to knock out critical components. And additionally, it's important to remember in War Thunder, if something is damaged, it can't then be damaged again. Hitting the engine and transmission when it's already out doesn't actually do anything extra or extend your repair timer, so you can't just use it as ablative armor until they're actually fixed. You can actually see both examples of this in the background, where I'm actually leaning the tank forward to start to roll down the hill and also show the opponent the base top part of my tank so they can't get critical components. And my opponent actually stopped shooting at me because I think they think that I've either repaired or been towed off the position by a teammate, but I'm actually still here. This also neatly segues into another rather interesting quirk of all of the S tanks. It turns out every member of the S tank crew has both driver controls and gunner controls, at least both the driver and commander. So in theory, the entire tank can be operated by one person. And in War Thunder, it in fact can be operated by one person. If two of your crew members are down, your tank will still continue to operate. This is a rather weird feature because it turns out the game doesn't have a preference for which crew member is left alive. And this actually creates a bit of an eccentricity because the commander is the only one that can operate the commander's machine gun. So whether or not you can use the commander's machine gun depends on whether the gunner is alive or the commander is alive, and there's no way to guarantee that the commander is the one alive. It's not that important in most cases, as the hull-mounted machine gun is just a basic rifle caliber machine gun, but it is one of those interesting quirks in that if you have exactly one crew member, there's no guarantee as to where that one crew member will be. Of course, we're not actually done with weird quirks with hull aiming mode and the vehicle's durability. It turns out if you have hull aiming mode activated, you can actually move and rotate the tank while you are repairing things like tracks without resetting the repair timer, which is kind of weird and will take some people off guard if they're not used to it. And the last feature of the protection is the ammo magazine. Now the S tank has 50 rounds and all of them are in the ammo magazine in the back of the tank, and all of them are considered first stage ammo. In most cases, I would actually recommend having less ammo, but in this particular case, if your opponent can shoot this part of the tank, you're probably already dead. Either they're sending rounds in one side and out the other of you, in which case they wouldn't have any issue killing you anyway, or alternatively they're around the sides, in which case they could easily kill you just by hitting the 3 crew members in a line. So in that respect, I actually don't really see much of a point in not just taking max ammo in these tanks, especially because as we're going to see later, their playstyle is pretty sedentary, so you do kind of want as much ammo as possible. So because the ammo is so far back in the tank, it's all in the magazine, and generally speaking, if your opponent can shoot it, you probably have other issues. You should probably just go ahead and take max ammo. Moving on to the firepower, which is the star of the show for a tank like this, and one of the differences right away is that the Tech Tree tanks, the Stridsvagn 103A and 103C, have roof-mounted machine guns, whereas the prototype premium vehicle, the 103O, does not. Not a huge deal because again, they're rifle caliber, but it is notable. Additionally, and this is something that might not be immediately obvious, all 3 of the tanks actually have a pair of rifle-mounted machine guns that are mounted pseudo-coaxially. They're in this little box on the left-hand side of the tank and fire basically in the same arc as the gun. Again, not super useful because they are still rifle caliber, but notable in case you do see something like an anti-air where the crew are exposed. The main gun itself is essentially an L7 105mm gun that you'll find on a lot of NATO tanks around this battle rating with a selection of shells to match. It is auto-loaded, and as we talked about earlier, because the gun, the breech, and the magazine all stay in the same orientation, it is very easy to have a reliable and fast reload. In this case, the reload is only about 4 seconds, which is one of the fastest single-shot autoloaders in the entire game. It's currently tied with the Type 90. This ridiculously high rate of fire is yet another good reason why you probably want to take as much ammo as possible for these vehicles. There is one minor side note in terms of the gunner's optic, and that is the zoom level when you go up to maximum zoom is basically the James Webb telescope. You can see people very clearly from across the map, so obviously the tank is well suited to sniping. The two 8.0S tanks actually have two different types of APDS rounds. One of them, which I'm showing on the left hand side, is your stock round. The other one, which I'm showing on the right hand side, is essentially the quote-unquote upgraded round. Now, one of the things that you'll notice about these two rounds is that while the upgraded round has less flat performance and noticeably less, it does have superior angled performance, and this is one of those big deals because basically everything you fight is going to have its armor angled in some capacity. So generally speaking, the upgraded shell, even though it seems worse in terms of flat penetration, in a lot of scenarios will be just as good, if not better. One thing I will say, however, it's not the worst idea in the world to keep some of the original rounds on your magazine, just because there are some opponents like the mouse where some extra flat penetration might be necessary. Both of these rounds share the common issues with APDS rounds in that their damage can be kind of inconsistent, and they do have a little worse accuracy than a fairly standard round, but at the end of the day they are very high velocity rounds with good penetration and should get the job done in most scenarios, especially because the exceptionally fast reload of the S tanks means that follow-up shots are fairly easy and fairly quick. Now for the 8.7-103C, it does have the quote-unquote upgraded round as its stock round, which is pretty nice, but it also gets an APFS-DS round that pins a maximum of 337mm and also has exceptionally good angled performance, and this shell is basically idiot proof. You can aim at the middle of the vast majority of enemies and will have absolutely no problem penning them, and the damage is a lot more consistent than it is on the older APDS rounds, so you should absolutely be maining this if you are playing the C. The tanks do have access to a smoke round, although I find I didn't really take them because honestly you can't afford to be that aggressive with these tanks given all of their limitations, so I generally didn't even bother equipping them, but equipping a few of them, especially because you do have a magazine 50 rounds deep, is not the worst idea in the world. Both tanks also have access to both a high explosive round and a HESH round. Now my general thoughts on this is that both of these rounds are essentially light enough in penetration that their only real use is taking out open top vehicles, so I would rather just take out the HE rounds. There are some very niche situations in which you could use the HESH rounds, and obviously you have a fairly big magazine, so you could afford to have a handful of HESH rounds just in case, but I generally only really use the HE. Now for anyone who thought we were done talking about all of the quirks of the whole aiming mode, man, you are in for a shock because we actually do have yet another surprise. If you look at this modification chart, there are actually two things that are missing that are on basically every other tank. That is a horizontal drive and a vertical drive, because obviously this tank does not have horizontal or vertical at all. It doesn't do that. It uses the tracks. So instead of horizontal and vertical, what you should research if you want to control how fast the tank can rotate is tracks, and if you want to control how fast the tank can elevate, you actually want to research suspension. But wait, there's more. All three of these vehicles have access to a laser rangefinder. Now on a normal vehicle, when you laze a target, what it does is it elevates the gun, and it elevates the gun pretty slightly to the point where you can't really notice it from the gunner's sight, and it will put it to where your crosshairs is basically aiming exactly where the shell will land. In this tank, obviously you can't just aim the gun, you have to aim the entire vehicle. So if you laze a target that is particularly far away, you will have this brief jolt as the entire vehicle raises up to aim the gun. So one thing I would definitely recommend with this vehicle is to pre-laze a lane, that way you're not lasing targets on the fly, or at least if you're lasing, it's only plus or minus like 50 or 100 meters, something that won't really jostle your aim that much. Lasing something that's 1500 meters away on the fly is going to be very disorienting. Overall, the firepower of this tank is actually phenomenal. The reload is insanely fast, you have a laser rangefinder, and your shells are very effective. The problem is more getting the gun on target rather than the gun actually working once you have it on target. When looking at overall playstyles of the S tanks, it's very similar to talking about God mode. When you're trying to get God mode on a lower tier vehicle, a lot of it is about positioning, and if you pass that test on positioning, then you will get kills, even if your tank is very under tiered. For the S tanks, it's more of a final exam on positioning. You can't simply snap the gun to targets the way you can a lot of other vehicles. And of course, because you can't snap the gun to target, the normal strategy that a lot of players use of just WM1 and click on things with red name tags won't really work with this tank at all. You're basically just going to get disabled and killed very easily. You have to go into every map with a good concept of where you want to be and what types of positions give you an advantage. And as the map progresses or degresses, you have to be willing to find new positions and and adjust to those new positions on the fly. This also brings up a rather interesting point in that it's easy to look at a tank like this and think that, well, it's good at really long range, but that's not entirely true. Certainly the high velocity gun and the laser rangefinder can allow it to be very effective at long range, but if you think at it realistically, this has a 4-second reload. If you're holding a lane, whether it be a medium range or even short range, and you kill somebody, their teammate is basically going to have to run at you right away in order to get to you before you have a chance to reload another shell. So a vehicle like the S-Tank is incredibly difficult to push when it's holding a position down regardless of range, because the enemies have to coordinate incredibly well to get to you before you can reload another shot. Of course, that also leads into the other problem in that if the enemy hits your engine and transmission, while you can potentially roll back down behind a hill, you can't move the tank to the left or right at all. So ideally, whatever position you have, whether it's long range, medium range, or close range, you want to have as narrow of a line of sight as possible so you engage as few enemies as possible and so you move the tank as little as possible. This does also bring up an interesting and slightly situational quirk, and that is the 103C actually has a dozer blade and can dig itself in. This is normally a pretty useless feature, but because the S-Tank has such a low profile, this can sometimes allow you to be in positions even in relatively plain sight where the enemy struggles to see you, or enemies will intentionally shoot at your upper front plate because they don't actually know that they can shoot through the ground that you've dug up in front of you. It is very situational, but every now and then it does come up. Additionally, it's important to remember that while you're in hull aiming mode, obviously your aiming controls will override your movement controls for the purposes of moving the tank left or right, but you can still move forward and backwards. So you can put the tank in hull aiming mode, roll up to a hill, fire a shot, and then roll back off of it while still in hull aiming mode without having to ever go out of it. All of these considerations combined make the S-Tanks a group of tanks that heavily benefit from you thinking about basically all of your moves beforehand, including where you want to be and what line of sight you think are going to be important at any given moment. In this respect, the S-Tanks tend to severely punish rash play, but also tend to severely reward thoughtful play. The problem is that it is ultimately still a very sedentary vehicle, and this is kind of reflected in my record in all of these vehicles in that while my KD stayed pretty solid the entire time, my win rate didn't really change that much, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that it takes a lot of work to get a vehicle like this that likes to be in sedentary positions to actually influence the outcome of a map. You really need either the perfect map, the perfect setup, or the perfect team to both have a good game and then also influence winning that game. And it's the type of combination that doesn't always come up. In this respect, I would say the premium Stridsvong 1030, both because it is a bit of a downgrade over the 103A in that it doesn't have smoke grenades and it doesn't have the roof-mounted machine gun, but also because it has a very specific niche playstyle that isn't useful on every map, is probably not the best buy, even though it is at least a very interesting and truly weird vehicle. With all that being said, and all of the frustrations that I did have at moments playing these tanks, I did absolutely love the Stridsvong 103s. They're the types of tanks that feel incredibly satisfying when you get them to work, when you get that perfect position and your 4-second reload makes you an absolute machine gun of death, mowing down enemies one after one after one. It's that unique type of vehicle that, despite the fact that it has limitations, it does heavily reward you for playing to its strengths. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the S-Tanks. Let me know what you think of these truly weird vehicles in the comments down below. Do you like them? Do you hate them? If you found the vehicle helpful, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.